The armory's back corner was nothing like the gleaming maintenance bays that most techs called home. Those places smelled faintly of ozone and disinfectant, with their cold blue lighting and spotless steel work tables. This corner, Zyraklov's corner, smelled of dust, old oil, and metal that had seen decades of use. A single fluorescent strip flickered overhead, buzzing in the tired, uneven rhythm of something that hadn't been serviced in years. The shelves around her looked more like the exhibits of a forgotten museum than an active military facility. Wooden crates stamped with dates from before her parents were born. Faded instruction manuals printed on paper instead of projected on a hologlass tablet. Weapons that hadn't been considered standard issue since before the first quantum targeting satellites went into orbit. But to Zyra, this wasn't clutter, it was treasure. She brushed away a fine layer of dust from the object resting on the bench in front of her. Underneath lay an M57 Fulcrum launcher. Heavy, mechanical, a Vietnam-era weapon that most modern soldiers wouldn't have recognized, much less fired. Her fingers traced the scratches on its body, the scars of battles long past. "Good morning, old friend," she murmured, as if the weapon could hear her. It wasn't just the history that drew her to these relics. It was the certainty, the physics, the unchanging way that levers, springs, and pressure worked regardless of what year it was or how advanced the rest of the battlefield had become. In a military obsessed with neural-guided munitions and autonomous drones, Zyra's comfort zone was here, surrounded by tools that didn't require an operating system to function. She began disassembling the firing mechanism with deliberate, practiced movements. The worn parts came free easily under her hands, each piece falling into place on the cloth she'd laid out. As she worked, her mind drifted backward, to a workshop that smelled of pine sawdust and gun oil. She was 8 years old again, standing on a stool to watch her grandfather restore a bolt-action rifle for the war museum he curated. His hands were rough, calloused, yet impossibly steady as he slid the polished bolt into the receiver. Outside, the snow pressed against the windows in soft white silence. "Remember, Zyra," he'd said without looking up. His voice was gravel smoothed by time. "When everything else fails, if you understand the mechanics, you're never helpless. Technology changes. Physics doesn't." At 8 years old, she hadn't fully understood, but she'd nodded, memorizing the words anyway. Years later, she understood all too well. The hum of the failing fluorescent was broken by the sound of boots. Heavy, purposeful. Zyra didn't need to look up to know who it was. Sergeant Eldon Merrick leaned casually against the shelving, his broad grin already daring her to take offense. "Well, look at this," he said loudly enough for the other techs nearby to hear. "The museum curator, hard at work. You keeping our antiques shiny for the history books." A ripple of laughter followed from the nearby bays. Zyra kept her eyes on the trigger assembly, refusing to take the bait. Merrick thrived on reactions. "Better hope the enemy brings a time machine, Clove," he continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Otherwise, all this is just nostalgia." She fitted the last pin back into the assembly, her hand steady. "Nostalgia's still functional if you know how to use it," she said quietly, not looking up. If Merrick heard her, he didn't show it. He pushed off the shelf with exaggerated casualness. "Briefing for Operation Thunderclap in 10 minutes. Don't get dust on the real equipment when you join us." He left to the sound of his own chuckle, his squad trailing behind him. Some glanced back with smirks, others with mild pity. To them, she was the odd one out, the tech who preferred dirty, mechanical relics over the sleek, whisper-quiet weapons that could hit a moving target 5 kilometers away with algorithmic precision. When the room was quiet again, Zyra reassembled the launcher fully, checking each function 3 times. Then, as an afterthought, she slid a slim tube of specialized lubricant into her pocket. Old habits. The M57 had a tendency to jam in damp or cold weather, a flaw she'd read about in after-action reports from wars long before she was born. Reports no one else bothered to study anymore. She slid the weapon back into its rack and turned toward the briefing room. But even as she walked, the weight of Merrick's words didn't sting. It wasn't the first time she'd been dismissed. It wouldn't be the last. What mattered wasn't whether they understood, it was whether she was ready when it counted. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind again. When everything else fails. Zaira had never doubted that day would come. And when it did, she would be ready. The briefing room looked like a war shrine to confidence. Holographic terrain rose from the sunken table in a shifting topographic ballet. Ridges flaring in amber, riverbeds etched in pale blue, approach vectors drawn as crisp white ribbons, cutting through simulated haze. Officers ringed the display with their tablets aligned like ceremonial blades. Someone had polished everything that could be polished, as if shine itself could guarantee victory. Zaira slipped into a seat at the back. She'd wiped the last smudge of old oil from her fingers, but the smell clung to her skin, anchoring her to the armory's dim corner. Up here, the air tasted like ozone and certainty. The base commander paced with a practiced stride and a trainer's voice, the kind that made hard things sound inevitable. Operation Thunderclap, he began, and the table obeyed, zooming in on a jagged valley split by a narrow road and flanked by two stair-step ridges. Objective: secure the logistics corridor, deny armor passage, and seize forward node Kilo. Quad-rotor icons blossomed across the projected sky, followed by a lattice of relay nodes that linked command to every soldier. Drone Swarms Alpha, through Delta-softened target clusters 1 and 2. Automated anti-armor teams interdict. Our comms will maintain continuous overwatch. Their doctrine is obsolete. Ours is integrated and adaptive. He let the last 2 words hang like banners. Zaira watched the routes illuminate. Position markers danced with choreographed precision. Too precise. Seamless plans had a way of shattering when the first ugly, unexpected thing happened. The commander's pointer traced the slope that would become her unit's logistics position. Support elements hold this ridge, he said, and a comfortable ripple of murmurs spread as if he had just promised shade on a hot day. Thunderclap finishes in 90 minutes. Then we go home. He paused. Questions. Silence followed, polite, anticipatory. Zaira could feel the question in her chest before she raised her hand. She didn't enjoy the attention. She enjoyed the ache if she didn't ask more. Specialist, the commander said, brows lifting a fraction. Sir, Zaira said, voice steady. Contested spectrum assumption. If the enemy deploys broad-spectrum jamming or an EMP variant, what's our continuity plan for command and control, or for weapons that require target linkage? A few heads turned. Merrick, 2 rows forward, didn't bother masking his smirk. The commander's jaw worked once, a small tightening around confidence. We have redundancy, he said smoothly. Triple secured frequency hopping, quantum encryption channels, hardened backups. Our countermeasures have countermeasures. He didn't ask if she had a follow-up, and no one else spoke. The briefing moved on, as if the question had been an intermission. Assignment tablets pinged with orders. Zaira's screen lit with familiar words: rear logistics, Ridge B, diagnostics, and repair. Non-forward. It was a job that kept her deployed, but out of a line where reputations were made and broken. She felt the old blend of relief and friction. Fewer eyes. Less risk. But also the quiet certainty that if things went sideways, the periphery could become the front in a heartbeat. After dismissal, the room bloomed with excited chatter. People crowded around the hologram to compare approach angles and drone timings with the same enthusiasm others reserved for sports. Zaira hovered until the knot thinned, then simply watched the battlefield model cycle again. No plan on the table had a blank space labeled failure. Most plans didn't. She tucked that fact away next to the memory of her grandfather's voice. In her quarters, she laid her kit out with ritual precision. Uniform, rations, medpack, multi-tool, gloves, spare batteries. She checked each item twice. Preparation wasn't superstition. It was control over the few variables you could actually touch. Then she stood very still and listened to a feeling most others talked over. A quiet alarm. It wasn't fear. Fear had a skittering energy. This was a weight that pressed even when she breathed shallow. She left the quarters and returned to the armory during shift change, when hurried people notice each other less. Her maintenance clearance slid her through the door. The M57 sat where she'd left it, clean and old and unapologetic. She wrapped the launcher in canvas, the kind of careful, practiced concealment that speaks of choices made long before the moment arrives. "Better to have and not need," she whispered, words she'd heard next to a workbench and winter light. The phrase didn't absolve her of breaking regs. It focused her on why she was breaking them. Morning rose in the color of dust. Vehicles coughed awake. Cargo slings clinked against armored hulls. The convoy formed with the reluctant grace of heavy things forced into motion. Zyra slid into a seat on a logistics transport, her pack wedged beside her boot. Around her, support techs scrolled through last-minute software patches and schematics. The air filled with confident status reports. Link stable, drone lattice green, weapons sync nominal. The words stacked into a tower of belief. No one checked her pack. No one ever checked her pack. Being invisible was irritating until it wasn't. The base fell away behind them. The road stitched through scrub and rock toward the valley that had looked so obedient on the table. From the back of the troop carrier, the land didn't look obedient at all. It looked like something that had been here long before any of them, and would be here long after. They reached the designated ridge without incident. On the far slope, the command post unfolded like a traveling stage. Antenna masts rising, scatter of consoles blinking alive, fiber spools rolling out like silver vines. Recon drones launched in coordinated arcs, a flock of precise black triangles gliding into the sky. On the opposite ridge, Merrick's squad moved with camera-ready purpose, each step a lesson in the swagger of people who trusted their tools. Zyra built her maintenance station under a sunshade, lining up diagnostic units, spares, and a battered toolkit older than she was. She risked a glance at her pack, placed within easy reach. It looked ordinary. That was its finest camouflage. Status updates poured in at regular intervals, clipped and confident. Recon phase green. Target clusters confirmed. Drones on final. The armory corner in her head countered with footnotes. No plan survives contact. No signal is sacred. She recited numbers to steady herself, wind estimates, line of sight distances, ascent angles, and then felt ridiculous for pretending math could blunt inevitability. Still, the numbers gave her hands something to occupy while the waiting stretched. The first wave hit on schedule. Distant flashes stitched across the far hillside, accompanied by a soft, delayed thud that trembled up through the soles of her boots. The command post lit with data, threat markers blinking out, terrain overlays updating to Triumph's rhythm. It all looked so easy from this distance. It always did. Thunderclap, enter phase 2. Someone at the comms board called. Voices answered from different units, crisp and interchangeable. Zyra leaned her elbows on the table and watched the sky. The drones moved like schooling fish, their formation beautiful because it was beyond the capacity of any single pilot. It was also a single point of failure if you thought about it too long. Merrick's voice crackled over local net, buoyant with the expectation of being right. Securing Ridge A, advancing to marker Theta. Minimal resistance. Her tablet briefed her with fresh tasks. Be ready for quick swaps on smart munition servos. Drones sometimes trip their own safeties after rapid salvo sequences. She arranged the parts by shape and feel, muscle memory, clicking through a routine no one else wanted to learn by hand. A gust curled sand across the ridge. Zyra blinked grit from her eyes and scanned the valley with binoculars. The place where the road widened into a pale scar seemed too quiet. The models hadn't loved that stretch either. Models tended to behave until they didn't. A minute later, the first glitch rode the comms like static. Not enough to cause alarm, just the faintest shimmer, a scratch that shouldn't be there. Relay 3, verify signal integrity, the comms officer said. Relay 3 nominal, a voice answered. The shimmer thickened to a fizz. Relay 3, say again. Silence. Then 3 error codes bled down the central display in a lazy red scroll. A tech swore and started rerouting with fingers that moved the way they did in simulations. Decisive, clever, fearless. Drones wobbled. Not visibly, not to the naked eye, but their tight lattice loosened by a millimeter in formation logic terms, and a millimeter is the width of a knife when the world is sharpened. Seeing packet loss across the mesh, another voice said. Cool. Too cool. Zyra's skin prickled. Her hand slid toward her pack without her telling it to. Reinforce with backup channel, the commander ordered. We're already on it, comms replied. And then the drones began to fall. They didn't spiral dramatically. They didn't explode. They just stopped being in the sky and started being objects returning to the ground. One clipped a ridge. Another vanished into the valley with a polite puff of dust. Dozens winked out on the board, the icons turning ghost gray. Merrick's voice punched through suddenly, stripped of swagger. We're losing targeting assist. His transmission dissolved into a smear of sound. On Zyra's console, error codes multiplied with the unhurried certainty of mold. She lifted her binoculars. The far slope, so recently tamed by drones, was alive with muzzle flickers. Positions that drones should have suppressed woke up and started throwing sparks downrange. EMP, someone at comm shouted. Not classic, another snapped. We're seeing a sweeping disruptor on variable bandwidth, adaptive jamming. Reroute, the commander barked. Go hardline. Sir, the local grid just. Another screen went black. The command post shifted from orchestra to improv in a breath. People who had trained for resiliency moved into their roles. People who had trained for victory only looked around for it, confused that it wasn't there. Zyra kept the binoculars steady. Down in the valley, something moved where something shouldn't have. The shape slid from a copse of scrub, low, deliberate, armored. Then another behind it. A column she didn't have to count to know was too many. Armor, she said aloud to no one, and then louder, armor in the valley. Her voice was swallowed by radio babble and shouted orders. The ridgeline shifted as forward units fell back, not panicked yet, but losing the clean lines they'd built themselves from. Weapons that needed links sulked. Systems that assumed perfect conditions behaved like sulky children meeting rain. Zyra lowered the binoculars. The pack sat beside her boot like a question already answered. The M57 was only metal and will. It would function in a storm of bad luck because it had been born there. She took a breath, felt the shape of the launcher through canvas, and looked up to see Merrick's squad on the opposite ridge start to pitch backward into cover. The first tank fired. The round landed short, a ranging shot, but range is a matter of adjustment, not fate. The plan on the table had never included this speed of collapse. Plans rarely do. Zyra swung the pack onto the table and unbuckled the straps. Old canvas side open, and the past looked back at her, heavy and simple. Better to have and not need, her grandfather had said. She had. And now she needed. The ridgeline was alive with the wrong kind of noise. Not the coordinated chatter of an integrated force, but the jagged clamor of people trying to speak into silence. Radios spit static like venom. Screens flickered, stuttered, or went black altogether. Officers hunched over their consoles, stabbing at keys as if pure force could restore the link. Somewhere down the slope, the lead enemy tank fired again. This time the shot landed closer, too close. The shockwave rolled up the ridge, kicking dust into Zyra's teeth. On the opposite slope, Merrick's squad scrambled into new positions, their movements less confident than before. Without targeting overlays and synchronized command feeds, their perfect arcs and firing lanes fractured into guesswork. Modern soldiers weren't used to fighting blind. Zyra crouched beside her maintenance table, the M57 laid out before her like a relic about to be blessed. She ran one last check, fingers moving with a calm she didn't entirely feel. Breach, clear. Pin, true. Sight, steady. Her hand brushed the tube of lubricant in her pocket. She pulled it free and worked it into the stubborn firing pin assembly, the same flaw she'd fixed in the armory. Her grandfather's voice rose up unbidden. A weapon doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be predictable. A shadow fell across her station. Lieutenant Kazan, face drawn tight, was scanning for something, anything, that might turn the tide. What is that? He asked, nodding at the launcher. M57 Fulcrum. Zyra replied, not looking up. Purely mechanical. Immune to their jamming. His eyebrows flicked upward. You think you can hit armor with that? At this range? I know I can. Kazan glanced toward the command post where chaos was swallowing authority. At this point, try anything. Permission enough. Zyra slung the launcher over her shoulder and ran toward the ridge's firing line. Soldiers stared as she passed, their sleek rifles now little more than metal clubs. She dropped to one knee at the edge, sighting down into the valley. 3 tanks advanced in formation, moving with the calm certainty of predators who knew the prey had been declawed. The lead vehicle's turret was already rotating toward their position. Merrick spotted her, his expression hardening. What the hell are you doing, Clove? Get back to your station. This will work, she said, still tracking her target. That thing's been collecting dust for decades. You'll blow yourself up. Better that than watch them roll over us. Before he could argue further, the lead tank fired again. The shell screamed past overhead and detonated behind the ridge. The concussion flattened the grass and sent a ripple through the line of defenders. Zyra adjusted her stance, breathing slow. No computers, no rangefinder, just physics and experience. She factored the wind pushing across the valley, the speed of the advancing armor, the known left drift of the M57 at long range. Her finger curled against the trigger. Stand back, she said, not loudly, but with a tone that carried. She squeezed. The launcher kicked into her shoulder, the rocket roaring away with a white thread of smoke. All eyes followed its arc. It struck the lead tank exactly where the turret met the hull, armor's weakest seam. The detonation was immediate, the secondary explosion violent enough to hurl the turret skyward in a spray of fire and shrapnel. The second tank took the brunt of a falling wreckage, its fuel igniting in a fireball. The third, caught in the shockwave, suffered a catastrophic breach. In less than 5 seconds, the entire armored spearhead was gone. Silence claimed the ridge. Even the enemy fire paused, as if the destruction demanded acknowledgement. Somewhere behind them, a radio sputtered back to life, the disruptor's pattern knocked off balance by the blast. Base to forward units. Do you copy? Reinforcements inbound. Zyra reloaded with smooth efficiency, the weapon an extension of muscle memory. She had 2 more shots ready. Down in the valley, movement stirred, hesitant, slower now. The enemy's advance had lost its confidence. Merrick stood frozen, eyes on the burning wrecks. The usual smirk was gone. In its place was something like respect, or maybe just the understanding that his life had just been spared by the very museum piece he'd mocked. Zyra didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the sight, searching for the next target. The ridge was holding for now, but she knew the battle wasn't over, and she knew the M57 still had work to do. The smoke from the valley clung to the ridge like a second horizon, the acrid tang of burning armor mixing with the dry taste of dust. Reinforcements thundered in from the south, the sound of their treads like a heartbeat returning after a near-fatal pause. Above, the drones were still dead in the sky, scattered where they'd fallen, black silhouettes against the pale earth. Zyra kept her eye pressed to the M57's simple optical sight, scanning for movement. She'd reloaded before the echoes of the last shot had faded, because confidence was a dangerous thing to grow too quickly in a fight. A puff of dust in the far tree line drew her attention, but it was just debris settling. No more armor, at least not yet. Clear, she called over her shoulder. Her voice came out calm, even though her pulse was still hammering from the shot that had turned the ridge into a legend. The nearest soldiers began moving again, cautiously at first, then with renewed purpose. Someone was already on the radio feeding coordinates to the inbound air support, and the chatter had a different tone now, tight, disciplined, the kind of precision that comes when panic finds a reason to shut up. Lieutenant Kazan dropped into a crouch beside her. His eyes were still on the smoking wrecks in the valley. That was something specialist. It was necessary, Zyra said simply, ejecting the spent casing from the launcher. Kazan's gaze shifted to her hands. Where did you even learn to use that thing? My grandfather, she replied without looking up. Maintained weapons like this for a war museum. Said someone should remember how they worked. Well, Kazan said after a pause, I think you just proved him right. He pushed himself up and moved toward the command post, already barking orders to reconfigure their perimeter. Not everyone moved so quickly. Merrick stood a few meters away, his rifle hanging loose in one hand. He was watching her, not the weapon, not the wreckage. Her. His face was unreadable. When she met his eyes, he looked away, like a man realizing the ground under his feet wasn't as solid as he thought. The rest of the afternoon blurred into a tense, holding pattern. Air support arrived, hammering the valley with precision strikes now that communications had partially returned. The enemy's flanking maneuver was broken, and their remaining forces retreated into the hills. By the time the sun slipped low, the ridge was quiet again. Quiet in the military sense, still bristling with guns and scanners, but no longer braced for immediate impact. The adrenaline left behind a strange hollowness. That's when the commander arrived. He stepped out of an armored transport with the posture of a man used to walking into rooms that obeyed him. Dust streaked the hem of his uniform, but his voice carried no fatigue when he called out, Specialist Clav. Conversations around the ridge stalled instantly. Zyra stood, the M57 still slung across her back. The commander stopped a few paces away. I've read the after-action feed. Without your intervention, those tanks would have rolled through this position before support arrived. Estimated casualties avoided, 37. She inclined her head. Sir, I just did what was needed. What was needed, he said, his voice carrying so every soldier on the ridge could hear, was knowledge this unit had forgotten. That ends now. He extended a data slate toward her. Effective immediately. You're promoted to Senior Technical Sergeant. You'll establish a new division, Mechanical Resilience Training. Every soldier here will learn how to fight when the computers fail. The words rippled through the gathered troops. A few muttered in surprise. Others nodded, like they were remembering how it felt when the screens went dark earlier that day. Zyra accepted the slate. It was heavier than it looked, not in weight, but in the gravity of what it meant. I'll need vintage equipment from storage, she said, already thinking ahead. You'll have it, the commander replied. Then, after a pause, and you'll have volunteers, whether they like it or not. His glance slid toward Merrick before he turned and strode back to his transport. The soldiers began to drift away, each carrying their own version of what had just happened. Merrick didn't move. When Zyra walked past him, he spoke quietly. I was wrong, he said. No mockery. No grin. Just 4 words stripped bare. Zyra stopped. Then help me teach them, she replied. His jaw worked once before he nodded. First volunteer, he said. I still remember how to field strip a rifle without a screen telling me where to start. They shook hands, grip firm, not friendly yet, but no longer adversarial. As the stars began to appear over the cooling ridge, Zyra finally allowed herself to sit. The M57 rested across her lap, its weathered surface warm from the day's heat. She began to clean it by feel, the same way her grandfather had taught her. Around her, the unit reorganized and recovered, soldiers carrying on in the shadow of a day that could have gone very differently. For now, the ridge was theirs. And for the first time in years, Zyra felt like the military might finally understand why she'd kept her skills sharp when everyone else let theirs rust. Tomorrow, they would start learning. 1 year later, the military academy gleamed in the sharp morning sun. Polished steel facades reflected the sky in fractured blues, while parade grounds stretched like perfect grids below. Inside, however, one classroom broke from the pristine future. Its walls were lined with weapons older than most of the recruits' grandparents. Zyra Klav stood at the front of that room. Her uniform now bore the insignia of a newly minted division, a crossed wrench and rifle over a gear, the emblem of Mechanical Resilience Training. The M57 Fulcrum launcher, once a dusty armory relic, now rested on a display mount at her side. 20 cadets filed in, each pausing to eye the weapon racks that flanked the walls. They'd all heard the story every soldier had by now, but few had seen the tools themselves. Welcome, Zyra began, her voice steady and clipped in the way instructors learned to command attention without shouting. You're here because technology makes you effective. But today, you'll learn what to do when technology stops listening. She tapped the M57's mount. Operation Thunderclap, she said, and a holographic recreation bloomed in the center of the room. The cadets watched the simulated ridge, the advancing tanks, and the sudden failure of every system they'd been taught to trust. They saw the smoke trail arc toward the lead tank. They saw the explosions. When the simulation ended, Zaira looked around the room. That shot was not magic, she said. It was physics, practice, and the decision to act. You will all reach that decision point in your careers. The question is, will you have the skills to make it count? She moved down the line of racks, pointing out each weapon. These systems have no circuit boards, no firmware. They are immune to EMP, jamming, and cyber intrusion. They fail in different ways, and you will learn every one of those failures and how to fix them. At the end of the session, most cadets filed out with the restless energy of people eager to prove themselves. One lingered. Her name tag read Reviz, her rank insignia marking her as top of her training cohort. Sergeant Clav, Reviz began cautiously. Is it true you took out 3 tanks with 1 shot? Zaira's mouth curved in a faint smile. 1 shot started it. But what mattered wasn't the number. It was that I knew how before I needed to do it. She gestured to the M57. Field strip it. Identify the jam points. Tell me how to fix them without lubricant. Reviz hesitated, then set to work. Her hands were careful at first, then grew more confident. When she finished, she recited, primary jam point, firing pin. Manual reset using spring override. Improvised lubricant options, water as a last resort. Zaira nodded. Reassemble it. While the cadet worked, Zaira glanced out the tall windows. Across the academy grounds, she could see other classes under a program. Navigation by stars instead of GPS, medics diagnosing injuries without scanners, comm teams practicing Morse code. What began as one division now stretched across the force, a foundation beneath the tech, not instead of it. Hybrid weapons with mechanical backups were standard issue now. Field manuals included contingency plans that didn't start with assume comms are stable. The newest generation of soldiers was being taught what her grandfather had drilled into her before she could reach the workbench. Technology changes. Physics doesn't. Reviz completed the reassembly and held the launcher out for inspection. Zaira checked the mechanism, found it flawless, and set it back in its mount. Well done, she said. In combat, your hands must remember faster than your mind can think. That's how you survive when everything else fails. Yes, Sergeant, Reviz replied, the words more promise than protocol. When the cadet left, the room fell quiet again. Zaira stayed for a moment, letting her hand rest on the M57's weathered surface. The tiny imperfections in the metal were like fingerprints from another time, a reminder that this weapon had already outlived generations of soldiers and would likely outlive more. She thought of her grandfather's workshop, the smell of oil and cold air, the soft rasp of his voice. You're never helpless if you understand the mechanics. The military had learned that lesson at a steep cost. But now, because of it, they were stronger. And somewhere in a future battle not yet imagined, another soldier would stand on another ridge, facing the moment when the screens went dark, and they wouldn't hesitate.